Welcome to the Skeptic's Guide to Investing with Steve Davenport and Clem Miller. Every 2 weeks, Steve and Clem bring you brief investment insights you may not find anywhere else. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Here are Steve and Clem.
Welcome, everyone, to Skeptic's Guide to Investing. I'm Steve Davenport, and I'm here with my partner, Clem Miller. And today we have a very special guest. Steve Gattuso is a CFA who we worked with at Wilmington Trust, and he's currently the Chief Investment Officer at Courier Capital worked there the last 14 years. And he's also a professor at Canisius in Northern New York. He's been a professor there for 13 years, and for 7 years prior to that, he was at Niagara. So Steve brings a lot of experience in investment management, but in particular, he's concerned about the national debt. Now, Steve believes in unicorns and Santa Claus, and he thinks that we can do something about this in a rational way with reasonable people and arrive at a solution that we'll all be happy with. I'm not sure any of those things are going to happen, but I think we should listen to him and try to understand the problem and think about how we got here, and then maybe it'll help us to think about how we get out of this mess. I'll just put up one parameter. Right now, our national debt is somewhere around 33 trillion. That's trillion with a T. And we are adding to that significantly, particularly because our interest expense has gone from about 200 billion to now almost $1 trillion. So we've added interest expense equal to or greater than the entire defense expenditures. So these are very daunting numbers, and I think that, great minds think alike. And so all of us believe that there are solutions, but the question is, how will they come? When will they come? And how ready is the economy for some austerity in terms of loading spending, and also some possible tax increases. So I'd like to say welcome, Steve, and tell us what you think how we got here and how we're going to get out of it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you very much for having me. I think this is one of those issues that maybe gets not enough attention. Maybe it's getting a little more lately, but there's a lot of people kind of putting their heads in the sand on it, or maybe there's just a general misunderstanding of what the problem really is. I know there are people who get the terms deficit and debt mixed up, for example. And what I usually do in that case is explain to them that your deficit, if I were to use an analogy in personal life, you make a certain salary, and when you spend more than you make, where does that difference go? And usually it goes on their credit card. So our deficit annually is the fact that the U.S. government spends more money than it takes in. So there is that national credit card. And when I further explain that the debt is when you get that credit card statement at the end of the month and you open it up and you see the balance, that's what you owe. So that is the 33, or really almost closer to 35 trillion that you just mentioned, Steve. And there's always there's that axiom you always hear that when you've dug yourself a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. And given that we are adding to that debt every year by the 1.7 to $2 trillion deficits we have annually, the first thing we got to do is hopefully stop digging. But how we got here, it seems like there's been a magnitude change in people's perception of dollars. I remember back in 2008, the great financial crisis, the Obama administration proposed a rescue plan to help us out of it. I think it was $750 billion. And at the time, I remember being flabbergasted. Oh my gosh, $750 billion. Now we've become desensitized to dollars. where unless it's got a T in front of it for trillion, we don't think it's anything to worry about. It's a drop in the proverbial bucket. So I think what did that is COVID too. The fact that once we got to COVID and we started spending trillions in saving the economy and rescuing the economy, that's probably started our desensitization to the amount of spending that we're doing. Right now, it was understandable during COVID. It was a national emergency that you're going to run deficits. That's what governments do. But after that, we seem to still be in this emergency spending mode where we're spending it on other things. And just to give you a little bit of facts around this, if you look at the federal deficit, that's the annual shortage, it grew by 7.5% of GDP from 2001 to 2023. And the reason I like to use percent of GDP, it accounts for that growth. It's not just raw dollars, because we can, everyone can talk about raw dollars till the cows come home, but you might not really get your head wrapped around it. And the economy has grown. But where does that come from? Well, just a few things. The mandated services spending that you're talking about. Social Security went from 4.1% of GDP in 2001 to 5% now. Medicare went from 2% to 3.1% of GDP. Medicaid went from 1.2 to 2.3. And then other spending went from 2.2 to 3.5. So basically our mandated spending went from 9.6% of GDP to 13.9. And that means that the spending grew faster than our economy grew, which is an unsustainable path. Then you add on to that net interest, which has grown. You add on to that discretionary, which has also grown a little bit. And it puts us in the situation we're in right now. And it's not all just spending, too, because we've also had an issue with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Actually, our revenue declined slightly, too. Now, the only thing about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was enacted in 2017 is it's going to sunset in 2025. So theoretically, at least, income for the federal government should bounce back a little bit. So, but when you look at all these, this is how we got to $35 trillion of debt, which is over 100% of our GDP.
So, Steve, our debt, our public debt of the U.S., except for a sliver, is owed to ourselves, right? The government owes debt, public debt, and U.S. Taxpayers and U.S. citizens basically hold a lot of that public sector debt in the form of treasury bills, treasury notes, treasury bonds. We hold that. The debt is to ourselves, except for a sliver, admittedly, that some other governments, sovereign wealth funds and the like hold. The vast majority of this is owed to ourselves. So given that, how much should we really be concerned about the overall debt?
Well, there are a few things. Now, you say we owe it to ourselves. There's some intragovernmental debt. So, for example, the Social Security Trust Fund, which we now are dipping into, is government owing government, if you want to say it that way. And I would agree. The Federal Reserve, which has also exploded its balance sheet, is quasi-government versus government, right? So those two, I see what you're saying. But given that we're the world's reserve currency, and given that we are the place that is considered the safe haven, there is, beyond just our citizenship, quite a lot of debt that's held by outside the U.S. It's not like Japan, where almost all of their government debt is just inside Japan. We have a special place in the world as the world's reserve currency. So there's a dependence on treasuries. And actually, that's one of the technical factors I was talking about. The biggest buyers of treasuries, which are kind of out of the market now, were the Federal Reserve, number one, as of late. But Japan and China, and then countries like Canada too, even, they owned a lot of our treasuries. They're done. Japan really doesn't buy our debt much anymore. China's been reducing it. So of the three biggest purchasers of US treasuries, three of them really are out of the game. In fact, the Federal Reserve is also selling treasuries. So I think that creates a technical issue.
Yeah. The Federal Reserve is a different question.
Right.
But how much of our overall debt is owed to the Chinese entities, right? And Japanese entities and Saudi entities and so on, versus owed to our own people?
Yeah, if you want to say to our own people, you're including things like insurance companies and pension funds, as well as individuals. So that is ourselves.
Yes.
But if you have an issue with that, in terms of, where's that a problem? Those are still arm's length entities. A pension fund can't give the government a break or take a haircut on the value of that debt just because it's within the country. So you've got to treat those just like you would treat, I think, any of those other externalities that we're talking about, whether it's another sovereign government or other foreign citizens or foreign companies. I think who holds the debt doesn't give you a pass at all in terms of the level of debt we have, because eventually then it gets to the confidence in your currency.
Yes. So that's where I was going with this. Okay. I think even though the vast majority of US debt would be held by, institutions and retail based in the US.
Right.
If you have a confidence issue at some point with the US debt or US credit rating or whatever, I think that's going to be manifest in a reduction in the market value of the US securities, which basically means an increased interest rate.
Yes.
Or yield, let's say, okay,
yes.
to be more precise.
Yes.
And the way for government to deal with that is essentially through the Fed creating more money supply.
Right.
Ultimately, at the end of the day. So that's what it's all about. I think it's not about, it's not about China. I read about this a lot about China or Japan or whatever pulling the plug. That's not significant in my opinion. What's significant is that there might be these broader market impacts which go to questions of interest rates and inflation. And I don't think this is it's not going to happen all at once. I don't think this is a tipping point issue. No. It's more of the boiling frog kind of issue where you're sort of sitting in the water's, getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and you don't notice it until it's kind of too late.
Yes. And I think the only reason we've been able to get away with this so far is because we are the world's reserve currency. You take that away and we'd be Greece from several years ago. So right now with our deficit situation, our debt, we wouldn't be able to get in the European Union. But
yeah, I disagree with that. Okay.
What about what?
Because the Greek debt wasn't really owed to Greek citizens.
No, you're right. You're right.
Okay. And like our debt is owed to our own citizens. Greek institutions owed a lot of debt to to Germans and to French and Italians and Dutch and elsewhere in the Eurozone.
But as I say, once you're a single euro currency, then you could almost say it's owed to themselves, right?
No, because the institute, they still, when they got into trouble, they still had to restructure their debts to institutions that were not Greek.
Right.
Right. And, if and I don't know what the percentage was, but I bet you it was 80% or 90% non-Greek holders of Greek debt. And we don't have anywhere near that in the United States. So, anywhere near that. So we can't really compare ourselves to Greece, or I would say Italy, even, or
No.
Spain, Portugal, Ireland. We can't compare ourselves to any of those so-called pigs countries from the,
Yeah.
from the 2010 to 2013 period.
And I was just kind of using that facetiously as a popular analogy because people always saw in the news about Greek debt. But I think you're starting to see some of the evidence of what you're talking about, where the frogs in the world are feeling the heat a little bit because you are starting to see some diversification, not only a lack of the same level of purchasing of treasuries by those foreign entities, but you see a lot of effort going into trying to create alternatives to US as the reserve currency. I know China's leading a lot of that, for example. So I think the world at some point is going to say, well, if we can't get away with running these massive debts and deficits, why should the US be allowed to do that and get away with it? So I think you're starting to see that turn. Like you said, it's not going to be an instant. It's not going to be an immediate reaction. It's just going to be that slow turn the way you're talking about. But eventually, it does come back to the currency.
Yeah. Right now, as we stand right now, there's no viable alternative even close to the US dollar as a global currency. And furthermore, I would argue, I don't want to get too technical, okay? But furthermore, I would argue that the whole idea of a reserve currency is really out of date.
Right.
Okay. Now, why do I say that the idea of a reserve currency is out of date? That was a concept that goes back to the time when you had fixed exchange rates and you had central banks controlling all the foreign exchange reserves.
Yes.
And what do we have now? We have global derivatives markets where there are spot exchanges, there are futures exchanges, there are options exchanges where you can basically trade in and out of all sorts of currencies, and not just G7, G10 currencies, but it can be currencies like, even you can even trade from Chinese currency into US currency, Brazilian into US, Brazilian into euro, China into euro. It doesn't matter ultimately what what a company or a person has in their bank account, what it's denominated in, because they can use these instruments now. They can use these exchanges. So there's really, the whole idea of a reserve currency is technologically obsolete, I would say.
Exactly. And the only thing
I'm not sure I fully agree with that. If you think about why there is such demand from institutions, particularly banks, for treasuries, it's the reserve issue, right? They need to hold a certain number of reserves, and guess what? They give 100% credit to U.S. treasuries. They don't give credit to AAA, institutions like J&J who have corporate that's AAA rated, because it's considered an industrial. It's not considered a national. So I look at it and say, well, we're creating our own demand for this treasury by requiring banks to hold it. And if we're creating that demand and suddenly we stop creating it because, hey, for shareholders, it might not be good. If we suddenly had a question about the quality of our treasuries, would the banks and everyone still follow the same rules if they felt like the treasury wasn't moving in the right direction?
And I understand.
I would disagree with you also on the idea that China isn't a viable alternative. China has already established its network of places where it wants to use the yuan, and I think it's starting. It is not near a point of replacing it right now. I'll agree. But if you look at China's views of 10, 20, 30 years down the road, they're going to continue. They are consuming every bit of gold that is produced in China is put towards their debt and put towards their funding as a reserve for the U.S. has about, backed by gold, still about 7 to 9%, I believe. China is less than 1%. So if China wants to be a reserve currency, they need to have more gold. And every year they're adding gold as quickly as they can. So when we say they're not there yet, I agree they're not there, but they are certainly moving in that direction. They have goals that say they want to be the reserve currency. So I think that given the number of choices we have, we need to focus on China. There is no one else besides China that I think could do this.
China has capital controls. And as long as they've got capital controls, it's not going to be a currency that is desirable by folks around the world.
Yes, but Russia seems okay with it. And so does, some of their other trading partners, right? I mean, they're creating a closed universe. I agree. It's not a free universe for flow, but they are creating demand and they are creating markets, and therefore, if they were to move more towards the mainstream, I think some of the capital controls could come down. And I don't want to wait and react to something. I'd rather kind of think about it ahead of time and have a plan for how we're going to act.
And I'll split the difference a little bit. Conceptually, I understand what Clem is saying, and I don't disagree. The reserve currency is a throwback to a prior era, and we're moving away from that. But in practice, that's where I agree with you, Steve. No one's really gotten off that yet. It's still the U.S. dollar and the U.S. Treasury is still used as the world's reserve currency right now, even though you're starting to see people trying to move away from it. Now, this bifurcation politically, we're in a multifaceted world. It used to be Russia and the U.S., but now it's, Russia, U.S., and China, and it's creating some of this as well. But, there are still things that are in place right now, which the U.S. dollar has a specific, special situation. Like, you look at gold and you look at oil. Those are only denominated in U.S. dollars. So if you start to lose faith in the currency, given the deficit and debt situation, then all other things being equal, in price of dollars, those two commodities should start to rise. And we're starting to see that, at least certainly with gold, right? But there's also supply and demand factors that go along with it. But I think that's where you also start to see some of these issues with lack of faith in the US dollar, given the fiscal situation, is you're going to start to see those commodities rise. And you're starting to see just what you talked about, Steve. China's starting to exert its influence and draw people away from the US dollar, as much as they can. Can't do much of it right now, but over time that could change.
I mean, I don't want to get too involved with the Fed, but let's just say the Fed, is the Fed going to lower rates in September and December because they realize what pressure it's putting on the government to have the interest expense so high? Or are they doing this to help improve the near-term economy? I would argue that they feel a lot of pressure because ultimately government is going to have to address, these continuing resolutions and everything they keep doing. They don't seem to be able to come to a budget framework that works. Therefore, if your interest expense just went up $800 billion, I think the Fed is under extreme pressure, and they won't admit it, to lower the debt and to lower the rates, because they feel that the way that interest is adding to our debt is becoming an unsustainable item.
Yep. This raw dollar amount that we're talking about, it really only is a phenomenon of the last 15 years, when we were basically in a zero interest rate environment for most of that, right? Since 2008. So we haven't had to deal with the combination of high debt levels and high interest rates, which create that carrying cost you're talking about. And even now, the average interest rate on federal debt is still climbing because of the roll that's happening. So as you mentioned, Steve, I got some figures on this. For the 2024 federal budget year, net interest is projected to be $892 billion, so closing in that trillion, 13% of GDP. Defense spending, as you mentioned, is $954, so they're within a hair of each other, and non-defense discretionary is $900. So going along this path, if interest rates don't fall, then we're talking about interest being the second largest piece behind mandatory spending of the federal budget, which limits what you can do and is going to limit your growth. So I am concerned about that. And at 35 trillion and adding, each 1% increase in carrying costs is $350 billion.
We'll be right back.
We hope you're enjoying our episodes. If you are, then we'd greatly appreciate your liking, following, and sharing. Help us help others. Now let's get back to the discussion.
Yeah, it's frightening. And I kind of believe that I like Clem's idea of, if we all owe it to ourselves, let's just all agree that we'll live with whatever it is. But that only works if you have a sustainable ability to pay that interest. And
right.
I think that as we look forward, I can't imagine that people are going to say, I want to own treasuries that I think the rate's going to go up on versus keep a rate in my example of a J&J bond. Which would you want to own, and which would you as a fiduciary be required to own? I mean, I had this discussion about ESG, Steve, and you can tell me, if we look at ESG and things that are, for reasons of purposes you wanted to be invested in things that you believed were high quality and didn't have negative impact on the environment or the governance or the society. I mean, do treasuries satisfy that? Are treasuries an ESG investment? I think we
no,
can
since they have
now,
defense.
but
Yeah.
I'm not sure we will be able to say that in 5 years or 10 years.
Right. And I mean, that's already started too. You look at what S&P 500, you look what Standard & Poor's did, back after the great financial crisis, they reduced treasuries to below AAA. And now you just had the same of another one of the underwriters express concern about it. So, that's already starting.
Yeah, and I don't know how you're going to be able to say to people, I can't invest in this because,
right,
it's quality or whatever isn't what, insurance companies, I think, have a lot of debt that they own and they have to own because it needs to be a certain quality level.
Yep.
Those insurance companies don't buy anymore. This is going to, rapidly change.
Right. There's your technical factors I was talking about. When you have so much debt that the role of that debt, plus all other debt in the marketplace, it is crowded out by treasuries, and you don't have enough demand from buyers, then there goes your yield, right? Your yield's going to increase, and that carrying cost, no matter what's happening fundamentally, that carrying cost is going to increase.
Right. And when we look at it overall, the impact of that debt in terms of how we view ourselves around the world, we've only seen things flowing one way, meaning investors have been putting money in. When we start to see the flow the other way,
right,
I think that we're going to see more volatility and we've got nations, China, Russia, Iran, Nigeria, we could go through a list of countries, Venezuela, who don't want to see or don't want to. I mean, we've weaponized the whole system by the way that we captured the assets of Russia during the Ukraine situation, right?
Right.
I mean, the fact that we took, the system, the SWIFT system, and we use it now as a way for political, leverage has encouraged more and more people to step away from the system, right?
Exactly. Less and less people interested in having, if I'm a bad actor, I don't want to hold my assets in US dollars, right? Exactly.
Right. And I know that gold isn't the answer. I don't think crypto is the answer. So somebody's got to show me where, there is a better answer. And I'm not sure it's, euro denominated. I'm not sure it's Japan denominated. I think that each of these countries has, glaring problems. But I think that we have to first look at our glaring problem and figure out, I think we know we're in a situation where we need something. The question I have for you is, all right, we've gotten here. How do we go from here forward?
Well, and there's only two answers to that, right? You either increase revenue, you decrease spending, or a combination of the two.
Or you inflate your way out.
And that takes a while. And right now,
I know, but it is the third rail, right?
Yes, exactly. Because that's a tax on your citizens then. Your citizens are taking the punishment for that because it's an invisible tax, right? So, and again, right now we're in a situation we're trying to reduce inflation. So we're not accepting higher inflation with this goal in mind right now. But the concerning thing is, we're in election season right now, and you listen to both candidates, and so far economically, since we just had candidate Harris's economic goals come out a few days ago, both candidates have policies that they're talking about that are going to increase the situation, increase the deficit situation. So you listen to Harris, and she wants to increase taxes. That's fine, but it's not increasing taxes with the goal of putting us in a better balanced annual budget situation. It's to increase taxes to fund more spending. So that's not going to help us out. You're talking about...
What about the taxes, or eliminating the taxes on tips? Do you think that'll help us?
No. And they're both doing that one. That was one I was talking about, they're both doing. But you're talking about Harris wants to increase, minimum wage. She wants to, she talked about relief of not only student debt, but medical debt. You're talking about $25,000 to first-time home buyers. You're talking about an increase in the child tax credit. All of those are going to have the impact of increasing the deficit situation, whether it's a reduction in income or an increase in spending. So that's not good. And you talk about Trump, he talks about tariffs, and he talked about the tips, the way you're saying, and his policies would also, another tax cut, he's talking about decreasing corporate tax rate from 21 down to something else. So that's a reduction in revenue. Both of these situations on the surface do not look like they are going to address what is a historically bad deficit situation annually.
Can I just bring up one concept? I mean, I've read about the idea of the U.S. as a business, and the concept is, what about all our assets? Don't we have a lot of assets in terms of land rights for minerals, offshore rights, and all of these assets that if you were a business and you were suddenly behind the eight ball, you needed to sell some, would we ever do things with the assets of the U.S. government to try to address this debt issue?
The question I have about that is scale. And I don't know, I couldn't say what we own. I know there's no study on that I know of or anything, but are you talking about trillions upon trillions of assets that we have that could be sold for market value in order to do this? And then politically, even if we did, would the will be there to put us in a better fiscal situation, or would that be seen as a windfall to spend on other things?
Well, I think it would cause a lot of controversy. So I would say that it has to be something that is a big problem. So when this problem blows up, which I don't know what it will be the precipitating event, but I do believe that a deep recession or some of these things could cause us to say, hey, this is unsustainable. We need to do something. What I was thinking of is, if you think about timber and in the land, if you took some timberland that was not near was in the national parks, but not near the assets of the national parks. Could that development cost and revenue you
Steve,
get from that
to
be beneficial to the country?
yeah, to some
And
degree,
we have to think about things that are different than the way we've talked about this. Like you said, it's a 2 or 3 solution problem, right? There's either spending or there's income. And I think that the other part of this is if you're an asset owner and you've got a problem, you've got to look at how do I liquidate some of those assets to solve my debt problem?
hey, Steve, to some degree, we're already doing that because we do have timber leases, we do have mineral leases, oil leases. We're not selling these assets, but we're leasing them, long-term leases. So there's certainly we may not be doing enough of it, but there's certainly a precedent for doing this in the future.
Right. I'm saying that we probably need a 5 or 6 pronged, I've seen different studies and they say they have different buckets and they look at the solution and, can we talk a little bit about the main subject, which seems to always come up when we talk about the deficit, which is Social Security and Medicare and extending the age, since we're all probably safe from seeing our Medicare or Social Security benefits change. Is it time for us to have a 70 age for Social Security? Is it time to have a 67 age for Medicare? And is it time for us to rethink the whole concept of what is retirement and what is, life after work?
And it's funny you say that because that's exactly what I tell my students in the financial planning class is that they better plan for full retirement age Social Security to be 70. The government's already done it once. I would see them doing it again. And their valid claim is that people are living longer. I mean, think about it. When Social Security was started, you worked to 62, you lived 3 more years and you died. And up until recently, we had more people paying in than collecting from the program. So everything was okay for all these years. Only now do we start to see it turn the other way. And I think those are certainly partial solutions. The other thing I would obviously add to that is the chain CPI issue in terms of increases in Social Security. So I think there are things to address it. But I think a couple of things. Number one, any solution like that is just prolonging the problem. It's not a true sustainable solution. It just extends it out a little bit more. So instead of 2033 or 2034, you might take it out to 2050. That's one thing. I think the fact that the system was built on to do things it wasn't supposed to do and extended by many politicians in the past has made this an unsustainable model. You just don't have that. And once your demographics turn upside down, it becomes even worse. So I think, those situations certainly, but I think there's also the perception among the American public that Social Security was supposed to be your primary retirement vehicle. And when FDR put it in place, it was never meant to be. It was always meant to be a supplement. So there are so many people living almost solely on Social Security, or it accounts for a majority of their retirement income, that I think that would be kind of hard to do in the near term.
What do you think, Clem? Do you see this third rail of Social Security and Medicare ever being touched by the political will of our country?
I think we're getting to a point where on age where it becomes increasingly difficult to assume that people live longer, right? I don't think it's not an arithmetic issue over time. It's really one where you have a declining rate of growth and longevity. And I think that, it's hard. In other words, it's easier to get from 62 to 67 than it is to get from 67 to 72 in terms of a retirement age. So I think it's going to be very difficult I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying it might not be like 1 year at a time. But it's going to be more difficult to be able to increase retirement age as we progress.
What do we think about how the tax question solves this problem? I mean, is a value-added tax that has 100% allocation, is not part of the budget process, but goes towards the debt? Would people be okay with a 2% value, 1 or 2% value add tax that addresses the deficit?
In a consumer-driven
So-
economy, you're going to cause yourself some growth issues.
Yeah.
Isn't the overwhelming idea of higher rates because of excessive debt going to cause some growth issues?
Yes, it is.
So one's a potato and one's a potato?
Well, I'd say one is more in the face of a voting citizen than the other one is.
Okay. Well,
The-
why
I
don't
mean,
we
there
switch
already
the
is.
value-added tax that everyone pays, and let's just focus on the people who are wealthy. Can we tax the wealthy enough to solve the debt problem?
Well, eventually there won't be enough wealthy in order to get there. So that's that problem.
Right.
No, I think it comes back to, in my mind, it comes back to who holds your debt. If you're funding this with foreign money, that's a huge problem. But we're not anywhere near close to that being a problem yet. If we fund it, through our own institutions who are thinking in terms of their returns on their investment, the yields on their bonds, yields on their stocks, returns on their bonds and stocks. And, if they continue to hold and price it appropriately, and, it can affect how much the government is paying out on interest, to be sure. Right. But I think that's the issue we need to be concerned about is that we can do some things around the edge. I don't think there's going to be that much of an increase in age. I think for the retirement, I think we will be able to do more in the way of leases of land. But how much more, right? We're already doing some of that already. So it's an issue. This is an issue. I wouldn't say it's necessarily intractable, but it's an issue that will be with us for decades and may progressively get worse, but not with any tipping points.
Well, and I would agree with the one point you were saying. If we stopped right now and said, okay, 35 trillion is it, and we're not going to add any more to that debt, then I think it's manageable, because you either, a combination of inflate your way out of that, and it becomes a smaller portion of your GDP as your economy grows. But I think the bigger problem is not only the current levels of debt, but the fact that we are on an unsustainable path of continuing to add to that debt faster than our economy grows. That's where I think we've got a really big problem. And no one is talking about trying to at least fix that part of it. Let's stop digging. Both candidates I'm talking about going to add more to the debt. So that's, I think, that the bigger issue. And where this comes to be a problem sooner rather than later is GDP drag, right? You got lower growth due to higher taxes if you're doing the income side. You got lower growth due to reduced spending if we do that. And even just their capacity to spend. As my interest expense takes more and more of my annual budget, that leaves less room to spend on other maybe value-added things. So you got a GDP drag, but then also you've just pretty much disarmed fiscal response to recessions as well. Now you've got that issue, because it's going to be much harder for the government under fiscal policy to come to the rescue of a recession. So you could have deeper and longer recessions. We haven't had one yet to test that out.
Yeah, I think that, to me, this is a really communication problem, right? Because people aren't talking about it and are just walking, we're talking about AI and the benefits of AI, but we're not sure how any of this really happens going forward. And like I was seeing with our energy policy, I don't think anybody knows how to plan more than 5 years in advance. I don't think anybody wants to plan more than the 1 year or 2 years of their term, or if they're a senator, 6 years. I think that everyone looks to get reelected and says, what is it going to do? What is going to help me? And so far, I haven't heard anything that I think is a running, plan that would say, hey, I'm going to be the most popular guy in the country because I've got a plan for how to resolve, and it's going to be higher taxes and lower like that's not going to extend his political career.
No.
So I look at this and I say it's as much a communication question as it is anything to do with the numbers. I think we have to have a serious discussion as a country about what is it like to live with deficit spending, and talk about deficits in individual financial literacy, and then talk about it as why the country doesn't show us how to live. Why don't we look at the budget and say, this year we came in at 17 instead of 19? That 2% going towards our debt, talk about what the benefits are and talk about the historic results. Because as I said, it's really been kind of a fortunate thing that we just continued on and had those, deficit. The overall budget is 14% of our GDP. And now that we're getting up to 19 and 20, it's probably time that we have a sit down and discuss it. But I think that there's no will. If there's no will to get rid of Saturday delivery of the post office, there's no will to get rid of some of these things.
I think the one thing we need coming out of this election is divided government. That'll help.
Exactly. That's my exact goal for the election.
Yeah, I kind of believe that will be the result, and I think it will help us. But I still believe that we're still going to have to do budgets every year, and we're still going to have a system that's mainly broken, and it doesn't really encourage behavior that I'd say is, until the government's ready to shut down, that's when we start really negotiating.
I just think back to our last government budget surplus, which was under Bill Clinton. And the reason he did it, the reason he had a budget surplus was because he was able to negotiate with Congress. And he, later on when he wrote about this, he said, look, this is what I had to do. I knew what my political limitations were. And so, he decided to make something of it, and that's what he did.
Okay. So if we could make two changes, one to the income side, one to the spending side, to help resolve the debt, what changes would you make and why? I'll start. If I could make two changes, I would say that we consider selling versus leasing in some of our usage of national assets. And in doing so, I think the lease to buy versus would probably be about 20 times that amount. So you would probably be able to more quickly resolve, and the only use of those funds would be for a reduction in debt. And in that way, I think and the other thing I would say is we are getting healthier. We are living longer with an average lifespan for men of 77 and women of 79. I think the ages are way too young. I would look at saying those ages need to be moved up to from 65 for Medicare to 70, and from 67 to 75 for Social Security. And I think that we need to have a system in government that takes care of those people who are older in the unemployment system instead of in the Social Security system. And in that way, you could have a much older age, and you could have people who are semi-employed or self-employed to a certain degree, but still receive a, say, $25,000 supplement or whatever that would change the kind of the look of how our system works with Social Security. Clem, what do you think? what would you change?
Well, I certainly, I'm at the point where there are things that should be studied and not necessarily implemented until there's considerable study afterwards. So one of those would be looking around the world and deciding on a rationalization of where our military commitments should be. And I'm not talking about a Trumpian, let's withdraw from NATO and all that kind of thing. But we have lots of bases overseas everywhere. We have lots of military commitments. And, it could well be, and they're very expensive. And it could well be that we can rationalize some of that. That's happened in the past. I believe the BASE Act or something like that from the 80s was an effort to do that, and I think that is certainly something that I think we should definitely study, take a look at, and take action if there are some ideas that can present themselves there. The other thing I would do is, I still think that there is a lot of manipulation of the tax system to keep money from flowing from overseas back into the United States by corporations. And I know that under the Trump administration, there was some effort to try to resolve that. But I think it's still happening. And I think there needs to be some way of being able to reshore, let's say, some of that money that's out there. So, if we can try to reshore semiconductor chips, we can try to reshore some of the profits that our global companies have made.
Okay. So reshoring and relocation or reallocation of resources for bases
of actual capital, not infrastructure, not plant, but financial capital.
Steve, where are we going to get the income and where's the spending going to?
Well, given that about 80% of the federal government's income comes from individuals, I think that's that's the pot of money you have to kind of study and rationalize. I think if you had a more simplified and transparent tax system, I think that would go a long way and maybe even bring in some additional revenue. I think all of the special loopholes and situations, they exist at such a point where increasing tax rates is really just kind of window dressing. So, for example, carried interest, things like that. If you started to attack some of these, I think a more simplified and transparent tax system would at least make revenue more predictable, if nothing else. And then, continuation of economic growth and promoting policies that do that is going to also bring in more tax revenue. So that's the income side. I think on the expense side, there's a lot of rationalization that needs to be done. You can do things like try to eliminate a lot of government waste and, make bigger government smaller. If you look at the jobs reports over the last year, a lot of these jobs have been added are government jobs, right? We're still adding jobs. So I think you can get rid of a lot of waste and that'll help a little bit. But I think the real meat on the bone is going to have to be some sort of change to mandated services that make them sustainable. And I'm not going to pretend to know what those would be. But yeah, something like an extension of the ages, that's certainly a help. But I think the mandated services have to be put on a model where the growth in them is sustainable, which is not right now. And that's what I would do on the spending side.
Okay, we're getting near the time to wrap up. Do you each have, I don't know, a mandate or an idea that you think we're not currently thinking of that should be considered when we look at the world as a smart system, and we think about how we can adjust this system. I look at it and say AI is supposedly going to be this big beneficiary. One of the biggest spenders is the U.S. government. Should we be, focused on using AI to help make the government more efficient and therefore our expenses less? Are there other areas that you think we're missing that some other country is doing a better job of in terms of rationalizing, whether it's budget controls, strict no deficit rules, or something that we could do if we had a magic wand? What would that magic wand do to solve this crisis?
I'll go first. Honestly, when I look around the world, I see a lot of examples that are worse than the United States. In Europe, I see a situation that's worse. Japan. I just, you don't have examples of states out there that, except maybe some very small countries that don't have deficits, and some of them have big debts as well. So I think I think that's there are no examples out there that I can think of. I agree with your point about using technology. And in fact, there is an organization within the US government that actually provides and helps out the rest of the US government as well as private industry in promoting technology and science. And basically, it should be called like the National Solutions Agency, but it's in reality called the National Institute of Science and Technology. And so I would fund that thing, fund it, and have it provide all of the solutions we need. We're still not going to get anywhere close to where we should be, but that agency could help out.
All right, Steve.
Well, I got
Take us home.
One thing, and I'll leave you with something that's not so good. I do think that some sort of restraint on deficits at this point is necessary, whether it's a certain percentage of GDP or an average over 3 years. I think right now, there's no limit and there's no consequence to continued annual deficits. And I think that's where we need to start, because that's the stop digging rule that I have. Like I said, the debt level, not great, but it can be managed right now. You just got to stop adding to it faster than economic growth. Maybe a deficit no larger in percentage than last year's economic growth would be reasonable. But the other thing that's a little bit more scary is that we're only talking about debt at the federal level. We haven't even started to talk about debt at the state or local level yet, which really, if I'm a citizen, I'm impacted by all three.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's a discussion for another day.
From how the federal government does an excellent job, and then they'll all follow in lockstep once those new ideas are implemented at the federal level, since we're going to talk about unicorns and Santa Claus. But thanks for coming today, Steve.
Thank you.
Clem, thanks as always.
Thanks, Steve.
I hope listeners have enjoyed the Skeptics episode today, and continue to like, share, and let others know about what we're trying to do to help make the economic wellness of individuals better. Thanks, everybody.
Good to see you. Bye.
The views shared on this podcast represent the personal investment views of the hosts. They are for educational purposes and not meant to be taken as investment advice. Listeners should consult their own investment, legal, and tax advisors. Past performance of any investments is not a guarantee for future return.